They said Jackson was a monster, and when his shadow fell over you, you believed it. The sun beat down on the dusty street, the kind of heat that makes paint peel and tempers fray. But the heat coming off Jackson was different. It was a cold fire, a rage that had been burning for 5 long years, ever since the day the river took his wife. He stood there, a silhouette carved from granite and grief, his eyes sweeping across the town like a hawk hunting for something to kill. He wasn't a man you greeted. He was a man you survived. Every soul in that town knew the story. They said his temper was a wild stallion, and on the day his wife died, he'd let that stallion run. They'd had a fight, a terrible one, and he'd stormed out, leaving her by the river. When the flash flood came, he was miles away, consumed by his own fury. He came back to a ghost, and ever since, he'd been living in a tomb of his own making, a ranch house as cold and empty as his heart. But that day, his shadow fell on someone new. Across the street, a woman knelt in the dirt, her fingers working a needle through a torn piece of cloth. Her name was Arabella, but nobody called her that. She was just the widow. 26 years old, and she'd already buried a husband and 2 children. All she had left was a needle and the quiet dignity of a person who has lost everything and somehow is still standing. Jackson's shadow swallowed her whole. She looked up, and her eyes, they weren't scared. They were just tired, like she'd been waiting for this darkness to find her all along. His voice was like rocks grinding together. "You so." It wasn't a question. It was a fact, an observation. She nodded once. "I have things that need mending," he growled. It was a command, not an offer. "Come to the ranch." Every instinct in her should have screamed no. The town whispered that Jackson wasn't just grieving, he was cursed. That his rage hadn't just driven him away that day, but that it had somehow called the storm itself. To go with him was to walk into a lion's den, but to refuse was to starve. She simply gathered her scraps, her movements slow and deliberate, and stood. She gave another small, silent nod. He didn't wait for another answer. He turned, his boots kicking up dust, and started walking. She followed, a small, steady figure in his giant, menacing wake. Behind them, the whispers started. Mrs. Whitfield, a woman whose tongue was sharper than any sewing needle, hissed to her friend, "He'll break her, just like he breaks everything else." And as they watched the monster lead the widow out of town, no one could have possibly imagined the truth. They couldn't know that the monster wasn't the one to be feared. And the widow, she wasn't there to mend his shirts. She was there to mend his soul. Or so it seemed. The silence on the way to the ranch was a living thing. It was thick and heavy, pressing in on Arabella as she walked a few paces behind Jackson's horse. He hadn't offered her a ride, and she hadn't expected one. This wasn't a rescue. It was a transaction. Her skill for his coin, nothing more. But the silence was loud. It was filled with the things he wasn't saying. The fury he held in the rigid line of his shoulders. The grief that pulled down the corners of his mouth. She could feel it rolling off him in waves, a suffocating heat that had nothing to do with the sun. After a mile, he stopped so abruptly his horse tossed its head. He didn't turn around. He just sat there, staring at the horizon. "Get up," he muttered, gesturing with his thumb toward the back of the horse. She didn't protest. She didn't thank him. She simply took the hand he didn't offer, placed her dusty shoe in the stirrup, and swung herself up behind him. Her hands hovered for a moment, unsure where to rest, before settling lightly on the back of the saddle. She was careful not to touch him. The ranch house appeared over a rise, and it looked exactly like the man who owned it. Weather-beaten, stark, and lonely. The wood was bleached gray by the sun and wind, the windows like vacant eyes staring out at nothing. A single mangy dog lay on the porch. It lifted its head, let out a low growl, and then, as if sensing the absolute futility of challenging its master, it laid its head back down with a sigh. Inside, the house was a cavern of dust and shadows. It smelled of old leather, cold ashes, and a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical weight. A thick layer of dust covered everything, a fine gray powder that seemed to be bearing the house itself. It was clear no woman had touched this place in 5 years. It wasn't a home, it was a holding cell. Jackson stomped across the floorboards, the sound echoing in the oppressive quiet. He dumped a pile of torn shirts and work trousers onto a scarred wooden table. "Fix these," he ordered, his back to her. "That's why you're here. Nothing more." Arabella ran a hand over the rough fabric. The tears were jagged, angry, rips made by frustration, not just wear. She looked at the torn cloth, then at the man's broad, tense back. She understood. He wasn't just asking her to mend his clothes. He was showing her his wounds. She pulled out her needle, a small sliver of steel that was her only true possession in the world. She threaded it with a practiced, steady hand. Her fingers, though slender, were strong and sure. She sat down at the dusty table, cleared a small space for herself amidst the clutter, and took the first stitch. The sound was tiny, a little snick as the needle pierced the fabric. But in the dead silence of that house, it sounded like a gunshot. Jackson flinched. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. He watched her. He expected her to be something. Frightened, intimidated, defiant. But she was none of those things. She was just calm. Her head was bent over her work, her expression serene, as if she were sitting in a sunny meadow, not the lair of a monster. The dog, which hadn't moved from the porch, suddenly got up. It patted inside, its claws clicking softly on the wood floor. It walked right past Jackson, ignored him completely, and laid down at Arabella's feet with a contented groan. It rested its head on her worn-out shoes. Jackson stared. That dog, Brute, hadn't let anyone but him touch it in 5 years. It snapped and snarled at Elias, the ranch hand. It was as mean and broken as he was, but it lay at her feet like a lamb. Jackson felt a strange prickle on the back of his neck. He crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe, his gaze fixed on her. The light from the grimy window caught the fine hairs on her neck, turning them to gold. Her needle rose and fell, rose and fall, a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Each stitch was perfect, neat, strong. She wasn't just fixing the tear. She was erasing it. She was making the fabric whole again, as if the violence that caused the rip had never happened. And he realized something that chilled him to the bone. She wasn't just a seamstress. Her calm wasn't patience. It was power. The house, which had felt so cold and dead for 5 years, suddenly felt different. The air was a little warmer. The silence was a little less oppressive. It was as if her quiet, steady presence was pushing back the darkness. He had brought her here to do a job, to be a pair of hands. But as he watched her needle weave its silent magic, a terrifying thought struck him. He hadn't brought her here at all. She had been sent, and he had no idea what for. The days at the ranch fell into a strange, silent rhythm. Arabella would rise with the first hint of light, her hands finding her needle before the sun had a chance to bake the world. She'd sit at the big wooden table and stitch, her posture perfect, her focus absolute. Jackson would sit across from her, a cup of black coffee cooling in his hands, and just watch. He was studying her, trying to figure her out. She was a puzzle he couldn't solve. She never spoke unless spoken to. She never complained. She never flinched when he slammed a door or cursed at a stray calf. She just kept stitching, her needle rising and falling, weaving threads of calm into the fabric of his broken world. He tried to push her. He wanted to see a crack in that placid exterior. One evening he came stomping in from the barn, his face a thundercloud. A prize bull had taken ill, and his temper was on a hair trigger. He snatched a shirt from the pile she'd already mended. He held it up to the light, searching for a flaw. "These stitches are crooked," he barked, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "This is shoddy work. Are you even trying?" The shirt was perfect. The seam was stronger than the original fabric. Arabella didn't even look up from the piece in her lap. Her needle didn't pause. Her voice, when it came, was as soft as cotton thread, yet it cut through his anger like a razor. "Anger," she said to the piece of cloth in her hands, "is often just grief that has nowhere else to go." The words hit him like a physical blow. He froze, his hand still holding the shirt aloft. No one had ever spoken to him like that. Not with pity, not with fear, but with a simple, unnerving understanding. It was like she'd reached right into his chest and touched the raw, festering wound he'd kept hidden from the world. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't speak. He threw the shirt back on the table and stormed out of the house, slamming the door so hard a pane of glass rattled in its frame. But he couldn't escape the echo of her words, and he couldn't escape the steady, relentless sound of her needle. Snick, snick, snick. A tiny heartbeat in the center of his silent, dead house. Something was changing. He could feel it. He fought it. He found her one afternoon, not mending, but cleaning. She was scrubbing the years of grime from the kitchen window, letting in a sliver of bright, clean sunlight. He hadn't asked her to. He'd told her to fix his clothes, nothing more. "What are you doing?" he demanded. She turned, a damp rag in her hand. Her face was serene. "It's hard to sew in the dark," she said simply, and turned back to the window. He didn't know what to say. He just stood there, watching as the light poured in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The light he'd been hiding from for 5 years. That night, a cold wind swept down from the mountains. He could hear it whistling through the cracks in the walls. From his room, he heard a soft cough from hers. The blanket he'd given her was thin, threadbare. He got up. He went to a large wooden chest at the foot of his bed, a chest he hadn't opened since his wife died. He lifted the heavy lid. The smell of cedar and memories filled the air. He reached inside and pulled out a thick wool blanket. It had been his mother's. He carried it to her door. He stood there for a long moment, his fist raised to knock. But he couldn't. It felt like surrender. Instead, he quietly pushed the door open a crack. She was asleep, curled on her side, a picture of fragile strength. He gently laid the blanket over her, his rough fingers brushing her shoulder. She stirred but didn't wake. He backed out of the room, his heart pounding a strange, unfamiliar rhythm. It wasn't kindness. He told himself it wasn't kindness. It was practical. She couldn't sew if she was sick. That's all it was. But as he lay in his own bed, listening to the wind howl, he knew it was a lie. He was losing a battle he didn't even understand. This quiet, unassuming woman was dismantling him, piece by piece, without ever raising her voice. And then he started having the dreams. Not just the usual nightmares of the roaring river and his wife's face. These were different. They were memories, fragments of that last day. His wife, Sarah, her face flushed with anger. "You can't just bully everyone into getting your way, Jackson," she had screamed at him. He'd yelled back, something cruel, something he couldn't quite remember. He remembered the look on her face. Hurt, deeply hurt. And then another image surfaced. Sarah talking to someone by the river's edge, just before he'd ridden off. A man. He couldn't see the man's face, but he was there. He woke up in a cold sweat. Who was that man? He'd never remembered that before. Had there been someone else there that day? He felt a sudden, sharp spike of guilt, so intense it was like a knife in his gut. He had been so consumed by his own rage, his own pain, that the details of that day were a blur. What if he'd missed something? What if the story everyone told, the story he told himself, wasn't the whole truth? He looked out his window. A single lamp glowed in the main room. Arabella was up. She was sitting at the table, but she wasn't sewing. She was just sitting there staring into the flame of the lamp, her hands folded in her lap, as if she was waiting. A terrifying new thought entered his mind. She wasn't just here to push back the darkness. She was here to make him face it. The town of redemption was built on two things, dust and judgment. And when it came to Jackson and the widow, the judgment was as thick as the dust. The whispers that had followed Arabella out of town had now grown into a chorus of condemnation. Mrs. Whitfield was the choir director. Her eyes, small and sharp like a bird's, missed nothing. She saw Elias, the ranch hand, buying more flour than a single man would need. She saw the new light shining from the clean windows of the ranch house, and she drew her own bitter conclusions. "Shameless," she'd declare at the mercantile, her voice loud enough for the whole store to hear. "That woman has no shame, throwing herself at a man like that, a man who let his own wife die." The words were poisoned darts, and they always found their mark. One morning, Arabella had to go into town for thread. As she walked down the main street, She felt the stares like a physical weight. Women pulled their children closer. Men stopped talking and just watched her pass, their expressions a mixture of pity and contempt. She kept her chin high, her gaze fixed straight ahead, but she could feel her composure starting to fray, like the edge of old cloth. She stepped into the mercantile, the little bell above the door announcing her arrival. The store fell silent. All eyes turned to her. Mrs. Whitfield stood near the counter, a vulture waiting for its moment. Arabella walked quietly to the spools of thread, her hands trembling slightly as she selected a dark gray. She took it to the counter, placing a coin beside it. Mrs. Whitfield stepped forward, a cruel smirk twisting her lips. "I suppose you have to keep his clothes in good repair," she said, her voice dripping with insinuation. "A man like Jackson must be hard on his things." A few of the men snickered. The store owner busied himself, refusing to meet Arabella's eyes. The humiliation was a hot flush on Arabella's cheeks. She said nothing. She simply took her thread, her dignity a fragile shield, and turned to leave. But the door was blocked. Jackson stood there. He must have followed her. His face was a mask of cold fury. He hadn't just heard the comment, he had felt it. He took 2 long strides into the room, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He walked right up to the counter and slammed his open palm down on the wood. The sound was like a thunderclap. It rattled the jars on the shelves. The snickering died instantly. Jackson leaned in, his voice a low, terrifying growl that was meant for everyone in the room. "Arabella's under my roof," he said, the words sharp and clean as broken glass. "That means she is under my protection." He straightened up, his gaze sweeping over their shocked faces, landing finally on Mrs. Whitfield, who shrank back. "Anyone has a problem with that? You bring it to me, not her." Silence. Absolute terrified silence. He turned, put a firm hand on Arabella's back, and guided her out of the store. They didn't speak on the ride back. But it was a different kind of silence. He had defended her. Not with kindness, but with raw, possessive force. He had claimed her. And as she sat behind him on the horse, her hands gripping the saddle, she felt a strange, unwelcome flutter in her chest. It wasn't gratitude. It was something more complicated, more dangerous. That night, a real storm rolled in. A monster of a storm that matched the turmoil in Jackson's soul. Wind howled, rattling the house to its foundations. Rain lashed against the windows in blinding sheets. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the very earth. Jackson battled to bar the shutters while Arabella coaxed a fire to life in the hearth. The flickering light cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the small room feel like the last safe place in a world gone mad. He finally stumbled back inside, soaked to the skin, his hair plastered to his forehead. He collapsed into a chair, breathing heavily. He stared into the fire, watching the flames devour the wood. "Storms never last," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Arabella looked over at him from the hearth, her face glowing in the firelight. Her eyes were deep and held a sorrow that seemed as old as the mountains. "No," she said softly, "but the land is never the same after they pass." Her words hit him. The land is never the same. He was the land, and the storm of his wife's death had washed away everything he used to be, leaving behind only rock and ruin. The dam inside him finally broke. "It was my fault," he choked out, the words tearing from his throat. "We fought. She said I was a bully, that I only cared about myself." He buried his face in his hands. And she was right. "I rode off to prove, I don't even know what, to prove how tough I was. By the time I came back," his voice broke, "the river was a monster. She was gone." He looked up at her, his eyes wild with a pain he had held inside for 5 years. "Her sister, Mrs. Whitfield, she's right to hate me. I did let her die." Arabella watched him, her expression unchanging. She let his confession hang in the air, let the storm outside rage. Then she spoke, her voice still quiet, but now laced with a steely strength. "My husband didn't die of a fever," she said. Jackson stared, confused. "Our children did," she continued, her gaze locked on his. "The fever took them both in a week. My husband, He was a good man, but he wasn't strong. The grief broke him. One morning, I woke up, and he was gone. He just left, rode west, couldn't stand to be in a house so full of ghosts. She took a shaky breath. He left me to bury our children alone. He ran from his grief. You ran into yours. Both of you left a woman behind. Jackson felt like he'd been struck by lightning. The connection between them, the reason for her unnerving calm, her bottomless empathy, suddenly slammed into him. They were two halves of the same tragedy. He, the man who ran away in anger. Her, the woman who was abandoned in sorrow. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. Not as a seamstress, not as a mystery, but as a fellow survivor. He saw the iron in her spine, the strength forged in a fire far hotter than his own. He stood up, walked to the old wooden chest, and opened it. He reached inside and pulled out the old faded shawl that had belonged to his mother. He walked back to her, and without a word draped it over her shoulders. The fabric was soft, smelling faintly of lavender and thyme. Arabella clutched it, her knuckles white. Her composure finally cracked. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She looked up at him, and in that moment, in the heart of the storm, with the firelight dancing between them, a silent understanding passed between them. They were two broken souls adrift in a cruel world, but tonight they had found a shore. And then the most shocking realization of all hit Jackson. He stared at her, a memory fighting to break through the fog of his guilt. Sarah's sister, Mrs. Whitfield. She hadn't been in town that day. He remembered now. She'd come to the ranch. She was there when he and Sarah were fighting. Why had he forgotten that? And why, after all these years, was he remembering it now? The morning after the storm, the world felt scrubbed clean. The air was crisp, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the dust had been washed from the thirsty land. Inside the ranch house, something had been washed clean too. The oppressive weight was gone, replaced by a fragile, tentative peace. Jackson felt lighter. The confession and Arabella's own shocking revelation had lanced a wound that had been poisoning him for years. The guilt was still there, a deep, aching bruise, but it was no longer the only thing he could feel. And his memory of that day was returning in sharper focus. Mrs. Whitfield, whose name was Beatrice, had been at the ranch. She and Sarah had been talking in low, urgent tones before his own argument with his wife had exploded. What had they been talking about? He watched Arabella move around the kitchen. She was wearing the shawl. It seemed to belong on her shoulders. She hummed a quiet, sad tune as she worked, a song of loss that no longer felt lonely. It felt shared. This new alliance between them was unspoken, but it was as real and solid as the wooden table they sat at. They were no longer just a man and a woman. They were partners in survival. But the town of Redemption had no interest in their peace. Beatrice Whitfield, fueled by a grief that had curdled into venom, escalated her campaign. She wasn't just whispering about Arabella's lack of morals anymore. She was spreading a new, more terrible story. She began to hint that Jackson's fight with Sarah hadn't just been words, that he had a violent temper, that maybe, just maybe, Sarah's death in the river wasn't an accident at all. Maybe she had been running from him, or maybe he had pushed her. The rumor spread like wildfire. It was exactly what the town wanted to believe. It confirmed their deepest suspicions about the monster on the hill. Jackson started getting colder stares, open hostility. No one would meet his eye. He was no longer just a grieving husband. He was a suspected murderer. The poison finally reached the ranch, carried by Elias, the hand. He was a quiet man who rarely spoke, but one evening he found Jackson by the corral, his face tight with worry. "Mr. Jackson," he began, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands, "folks in town, they're saying terrible things. Mrs. Whitfield she's telling people you hurt your wife." Jackson's fists clenched. The old rage, the familiar fire, surged in his chest. He wanted to ride into town and what? He couldn't fight a rumor. He couldn't punch a lie. He saw Arabella on the porch watching them. She had the shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, a shield against a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. He saw the fear in her eyes, not for herself, but for him. And in that moment, his rage cooled, replaced by a grim determination. He wouldn't let them do this. He wouldn't let them poison this fragile new thing he was building with her. That night he approached Elias again. "Elias," he said, his voice low and serious, "I need you to think, and think hard. The day Sarah died, you were here. Did you see anything? Anything at all?" Elias paled. He stared at the ground, his body tense. "Mr. Jackson, I don't want no trouble." "This is trouble," Jackson said, his voice like iron. "Tell me what you saw." Elias took a deep, shuddering breath. "I saw you ride out," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You were angry. I saw Mrs. Jackson by the river. She was crying." He hesitated. "What else?" Jackson pressed. "There was someone else there," Elias mumbled, still not looking up. "After you left. I was in the high pasture. I couldn't see clear. But there was a man. He was talking to her." Jackson's blood ran cold. The dream. The memory. "Who was it?" I think it was Mr. Whitfield," Elias stammered. "Beatrice's husband. You know how he is with the drink and the cards. I saw them arguing. And then the sky got dark. Real dark. I took the sheep to shelter. I didn't see nothing else. I swear." He finally looked up, his eyes pleading. "I was afraid to say nothing. Afraid of you, Mr. Jackson, and afraid of what it meant. Mr. Whitfield, a weak man, a gambler who was always in debt. What in God's name was he doing arguing with Sarah by the river, moments before the storm hit?" The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture that was darker and more twisted than he could have ever imagined. Beatrice Whitfield wasn't just a grieving sister spreading hateful rumors. She was creating a smokescreen, a distraction. She was hiding something. Jackson strode back to the house, his mind racing. He found Arabella at the table, mending a shirt, her needle a tiny, steady anchor in his swirling chaos. He stopped in front of her. "I'm going into town, Yorena," he said, his voice tight. "I'm going to talk to Beatrice Whitfield." Arabella looked up. Her eyes were clear and steady. She put her sewing down, folded her hands, and said 2 words. "We are." She stood up, walked to the door, and took the shawl from the peg. His mother's shawl. She wrapped it around her shoulders like armor. She wasn't going to let him face this alone. As they rode toward town, side by side on 2 horses, Jackson felt a sense of clarity he hadn't known in years. He wasn't riding into a fight fueled by rage. He was riding toward the truth, with the strongest person he had ever known beside him. He realized his quest was no longer just about clearing his own name. It was about protecting hers. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would burn the whole world down before he let anyone hurt her again. The main street of Redemption was buzzing with a nervous energy when Jackson and Arabella rode in. It was as if the town itself sensed a final showdown was coming. People stopped what they were doing, their faces turning to watch the grim-faced rancher and the quiet woman beside him. The whispers died on their lips, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. They found Beatrice Whitfield holding court on the steps of the Mercantile, surrounded by a small group of her most loyal gossips. She was in the middle of a dramatic, tear-filled performance about her poor, dear sister Sarah. When she saw Jackson and Arabella, her face hardened. The feigned tears vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "Well, well," she spat, her voice carrying across the street. "Look what the storm washed in. Come to threaten me, Jackson. Have your little seamstress stitch my mouth shut?" Jackson dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate. He walked not to Beatrice, but to the center of the street, forcing everyone to look at him. Arabella remained on her horse, a silent, watchful queen on her throne, the faded shawl a royal mantle around her shoulders. Her presence gave him strength. "I didn't come to threaten you, Beatrice," Jackson said, his voice calm but powerful, resonating through the unnatural quiet. "I came to ask you a question." He paused, letting the tension build. He looked around, meeting the eyes of the townspeople who had judged him for so long. "Why was your husband arguing with my wife by the river?" Minutes before she died. The question landed like a physical blow. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Beatrice Whitfield's face went white as a sheet. For the first time, her venomous certainty wavered. That's, that's a lie, she shrieked, her voice cracking. My husband was at home that day. He was sick. Was he? Jackson continued, his voice relentless. He took a step closer. Was he sick? Or was he asking my wife to cover his gambling debts again? Debts he owed to men who don't take kindly to being kept waiting? Panic flashed in Beatrice's eyes. She looked around for support, but the faces surrounding her were now filled with doubt, not sympathy. Where is he, Beatrice? Jackson demanded. Where is your husband right now? As if on cue, a side door of the saloon swung open, and Mr. Whitfield, a shambling, bleary-eyed man, stumbled out into the sunlight. He blinked, confused by the silent crowd. Beatrice, he mumbled. What's going on? Every head turned toward him. He was trapped in the spotlight of 100 accusing eyes. Jackson fixed his gaze on the pathetic man. Tell them, Whitfield, he commanded. Tell them what you were doing at the river. Mr. Whitfield started to tremble. He looked at his wife, whose face was a mask of terror. I don't know what you're talking about, he stammered. Don't you? Jackson's voice was like ice. You and Sarah fought. Elias saw you. He saw you yelling, saw you grab her arm. What happened next, Whitfield? Did she refuse to give you the money? Did you get angry? No, it wasn't like that, Whitfield cried, wringing his hands. The crowd instinctively moved back, forming a circle around them. This was no longer gossip. This was a confession. I just wanted to talk to her, he sobbed. I owed money, a lot of money. I knew her father had left her some. I begged her, but she said no. She said she wouldn't enable me anymore. She said she was going to tell Beatrice everything. He looked at his wife, his eyes pleading. We argued. I didn't mean any harm. I grabbed her arm to stop her from leaving. She pulled away. She stumbled. His voice dropped to a choked whisper. The bank was slick with mud from the rains. She slipped. She fell into the water just as the first wave of the flood came down the canyon. The entire town held its breath. I couldn't reach her, he cried, tears streaming down his face. The current was too strong. She was gone in a second. I panicked. I ran. I knew everyone would blame me, or worse, they'd blame Jackson, and I let them. He collapsed onto the dusty street, a sobbing, broken man. The truth, ugly and raw, hung in the air. Sarah's death wasn't a mystery solved by a hero. It was a tragedy caused by a weak man's desperation and another weak man's cowardice. Beatrice Whitfield stared at her husband, her face crumbling. Her entire identity for the past 5 years, the grieving sister, the righteous accuser, had been built on a lie. A lie she had perhaps wanted to believe because the truth of her own husband's weakness was too much to bear. Her hatred for Jackson had been a shield, protecting her from her own broken life. And Jackson was free. The weight of 5 years of guilt, of being the town monster, lifted from his shoulders. He didn't feel triumphant. He just felt empty. And then he felt a new sensation fill the void. He looked over at Arabella. She was looking right at him, and for the first time, he saw a small, brilliant smile on her face. A smile of pride, of relief, of a shared victory. The townspeople stood in stunned silence, shamed by their own judgment. They had been so eager to believe in a monster, they had overlooked the real, pathetic villain in their midst. Jackson walked back to Arabella. He looked up at her, this quiet woman who had come into his life and forced him to face the truth. Not with accusations, but with a steady, unwavering belief in the man he could be. Let's go home, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She simply nodded, her eyes shining. As they rode out of town, leaving the wreckage of the Whitfields' lives and the town's shame behind them, Jackson knew one thing for certain. He was done with the past. He was done with the rage and the grief. He rode closer to Arabella so their horses were side by side. He didn't have to say the words. She could see them in his eyes. The storm was finally over, and the land, while forever changed, was ready for something new to grow. The ride back to the ranch was a new kind of silent. It wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of their first journey, nor the tense, uncertain silence of the days that followed. This was a comfortable quiet, a peaceful emptiness that was full of unspoken understanding. The air itself felt different, washed clean, not just by the storm, but by the truth. They reached the ranch as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange, pink, and deep lavender. The stark, lonely house no longer looked like a tomb. In the warm glow of the sunset, it looked like a home, welcoming, full of possibility. The dog, Brute, came bounding off the porch, not with a growl, but with a happy bark, his tail wagging furiously. He ran circles around Arabella's horse, jumping up to lick her hand. They dismounted, and for a long moment, they just stood there, side by side, watching the last sliver of sun disappear. Jackson turned to her. The harsh lines on his face, carved by years of grief and anger, had softened. His eyes, which had always burned with a restless fire, were now clear and calm. "Arabella," he began, his voice rough with an emotion he was still learning to name. For 5 years, this house has been a prison. I was serving a sentence for a crime I only half committed. The crime of anger, of pride." He took a step closer. "You came here, and you didn't try to change me. You just were. You were quiet and strong and true. You showed me that mending isn't about forgetting the tear. It's about making it strong enough to hold again." He reached out and took her hand. His calloused, rough palm enveloped her slender fingers. "I can't offer you a life without scars. Both of us have too many of those. But I can offer you a life where you don't have to carry them alone." His gaze was intense, unwavering. "The town will keep talking. Let them. Their words are just wind now. But I can't have you living under my roof as my seamstress any longer. It's not right. Not after everything." Her breath hitched. She looked from his earnest face to their joined hands. "Marry me, Arabella," he said, the words simple and direct. "Don't marry a monster or a rancher or a man seeking protection. Marry me, Jackson, and let's build a new life right here on the ashes of the old one." Her eyes filled with tears, but these were not the tears of sorrow she had shed before. These were tears of joy, of a relief so profound it shook her to her core. For the first time since she had lost her family, she felt seen. She felt chosen. Her voice, when she answered, was a clear, steady whisper. "Yes." The word was small, but it was the strongest thing in the world. It echoed across the silent prairie, a promise made not under the judgmental eyes of the town, but under the vast, accepting witness of the sky. He didn't kiss her. It wasn't the time for that. Instead, he simply lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle, reverent kiss to her knuckles. A vow made without a preacher, a commitment sealed without a ring. They stood there for a long time as the stars began to appear, one by one, like tiny scattered diamonds on black velvet. A few days later, they stood before the town's weary preacher. Elias was there, standing as Jackson's witness, his weathered face split by a proud grin. A few curious townspeople watched from a distance, their judgment finally silenced by a truth they couldn't deny. Arabella wore a simple dress she had mended herself, and over her shoulders was his mother's shawl. Jackson stood tall beside her, his hat in his hands, his heart full. Their vows were not the flowery promises of youth. They were the sturdy, seasoned words of survivors. They spoke of patience, of shared burdens, of finding shelter in each other when the world was cold. They promised to honor the ghosts of their past, but not to let them haunt their future. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, a genuine smile broke across Jackson's face, transforming him. It was a smile of such pure, unadulterated happiness that it seemed to light up the whole dusty chapel. Back at the ranch, the house was filled with a new sound. Laughter. Elias told a clumsy joke, and Arabella's soft laugh mingled with Jackson's deep, rumbling one. The dog barked as if joining in. It was the sound of a family being born. That evening, they stood on the porch together, shoulders touching, watching the stars come out. The air was cool and smelled of sage and damp earth. The silence was back, but now it was a blanket of comfort, woven with threads of shared hope. Jackson looked at his wife, her profile serene in the moonlight, the shawl pulled tight around her. He finally understood. Strength wasn't about rage or fury. It wasn't about building walls to keep the world out. True strength was quiet. It was patient. It was the courage to sit in the darkness with someone until they were ready to see the light. It was the strength of a needle, pulling two torn pieces of fabric together, one steady stitch at a time. Storms don't last, he said softly, repeating the words that had started it all. Arabella turned to him, her eyes shining with a love that was as deep and resilient as the prairie itself. No, she agreed, but sometimes they leave behind the clearest skies, and in the quiet peace of the ranch, under a brilliant canopy of stars, their new life began. A life stitched together not by fate, but by choice. Not by passion, but by a profound and steady partnership. A testament that even the most broken things can be mended, and that the most fearsome monsters are often just men waiting for someone brave enough to see the heart behind the scars. This story is a powerful reminder that our past doesn't have to define our future. Both Jackson and Arabella were trapped by their grief, but they found a way forward together. We all face storms in our lives, moments that threaten to break us. But as their story shows, it's often in the aftermath, in the quiet rebuilding, that we find our greatest strength. What was the biggest storm you've ever had to overcome in your life? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience could be the light that helps someone else through their own darkness. And if you enjoyed this journey from heartbreak to healing, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We have so many more stories to share, and you won't want to miss a single one. Thanks for watching.